Okay, so by now you've probably listened to at least bits and pieces of Jeremy Mayfield's appearance on the Dale Jr. Download. The first half of Mayfield's NASCAR career is really interesting. He's a solid journeyman driver who bounced around from team to team, eventually winding up as the second driver for both Roger Penske as well as Ray Evernham, and he was a fairly likable underdog driver with no major incidents or outbursts or anything like that. In 2006, however, his career kind of took an abrupt turn as he made subtle remarks implying his car owner Ray Evernham was fucking their development driver, which ended up being true as they're married and have a kid together now. Anyway, moving on. Mayfield was ditched by Evernham Motorsports and was forced to start his own team to try and stay in the NASCAR Cup Series during the Car of Tomorrow era. This would have been 2008 or 2009. At this point in time, NASCAR simultaneously rolled out a brand new drug policy, which they never had before, and as Dale Jr. explains on his show, was extremely vague and they did not know what substances were banned or what they could or could not take.
To be clear, like in my position, it was so vague you were scared to do anything. You were scared to take any cold medication or any. You
Right.
weren't, because you didn't know, you didn't have a clear list. I think this was after your suspension. NASCAR brought all the drivers together and talking about the drug policy. And I remember he drove the Claritin D car. Carl Edwards. He raises his hand. Carl's like, what about, what about these over-the-counter drugs that are on our race cars, right? What about these, And they really weren't clear on what to tell you about that.
Mayfield at the time had a prescription for Adderall, which is just ADHD medication, and if you watch him in interviews, like, he needs it. Sorry, Jeremy. But on a drug test, this can produce a false positive for amphetamines. NASCAR kind of jumped the gun and accused him of meth use, which just didn't make sense because Mayfield had been in the sport over 10 years at this point and was just a random journeyman driver. Chronic meth users, or people who smoke the amount of meth NASCAR claimed Jeremy was doing, do not look like Jeremy Mayfield. They look like this. There was a lot of legal back and forth where Jeremy was actually successful on some fronts, getting his license reinstated by a judge, but NASCAR was able to get the whole thing thrown out of court by saying, hey, look, when you sign the agreement for your hard card to be in our series each year, you essentially waive a ton of your rights, including the right to sue us, so goodbye, fuck you. So with Mayfield being a permanently suspended NASCAR member, he can't race any NASCAR sanctioned series, so he's primarily stuck to modifieds and dirt late models that aren't under the NASCAR banner. He's also done what's essentially a decade-long podcast tour in which anyone who gives him a platform to talk, he will spend 3 hours crying about NASCAR and how awful they are. Judging by the reception on social media, whenever it's announced he's doing another podcast like this, people just kind of laugh at him and say, oh god, what crazy stories are you going to tell now? And don't really take this guy seriously. I'm here to say that maybe you should. In particular, there's a story he tells about the 2011 police raid on his property in North Carolina, where he claims the SWAT team showed up at his house, basically destroyed his house, and planted drugs on him. Him telling this story makes him sound crazy and like he's a meth head. So what if I told you that the cops in North Carolina were actually doing this, and it was a massive scandal that only came to a conclusion 6 months ago?
Laura and Steve, it's been 14 months since our first reporting on Detective Omar Abdullah and those fake heroin arrests, or fake heroin drug arrests that put over a dozen men in jail. Advocates who say these cases are just the tip of an iceberg, celebrating what they say is a win for accountability. RPD confirming the news tonight in an email. Detective Omar Abdullah was terminated from the Raleigh Police Department on October 28, 2021. The 12-year RPD veteran fired 1 month after the city agreed to pay $2 million to 15 men who alleged in a federal lawsuit that Abdullah and other officers worked with a criminal informant to frame them with fake heroin, landing the men in the Wake jail for months with high-dollar bonds.
Now, while this may not have been happening in Jeremy Mayfield's exact county, it was happening within the state. This was a real thing that was going on. And on top of that, multiple articles cite that at least 7 different police officers all knew that this was going on as well and just didn't give a fuck. To me, this kind of implies that A, this was common practice, and this Omar Abdullah guy got the idea from somewhere else within the state because they were doing it so frequently. And he was just the guy who got caught because he was so brazen about it. Mayfield living in a different county within North Carolina and yet still being subjected to this exact same chain of events could potentially blow the lid off what is a statewide operation featuring several different police officers. It wouldn't be the first time Mayfield has come out with a crazy story, only to be proven right several years later.
Bad weekend for the CEO of NASCAR. Brian France was arrested over the weekend for DUI, and cops say he was also in criminal possession of oxycodone.